for joining us this evening. For those who don't know, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And thanks for coming along to Politics in the Pub tonight. Tonight we're super excited to be launching Jordan Guiao's new book, Disconnect. And you can buy copies of Disconnect over here on the right-hand side from Paper Chain, available for purchase all evening. But before we begin tonight's proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight. Sorry, if I could just ask the bar staff to get the music turned off. Thank you, sorry. I was meant to tell them about that.
Otherwise
and give them an indication.
Some awkward moving around.
There might be. Yes, I did want to pay respects to the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and extend that thanks to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people coming along this evening. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And if you missed today's National Press Club address, I recommend you check it out on iView. Pete and I were both there today. Professor Megan Davis and Pat Anderson, two of the 3 First Nations recipients of the Sydney Peace Prize for this year, addressed the National Press Club about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's really worthwhile checking out. I think that should be up on iView this afternoon. We do love hosting Politics in the Pub at the Australia Institute, and we thank you all for coming along this evening. And if you can and find a moment, we do love to get donations for this evening. We put these on for free, but they're not free to run, and there's always a donations box, or you can jump online at australiainstitute.org.au. But tonight, as I mentioned, we are very excited to be launching Jordan's new book, Disconnect, Why We Get Pushed to Extremes Online and How to Stop It. Seems like a very timely book, given data breaches, Twitter being overtaken by new management, and put your hand up if your phone is the first thing you pick up when you wake up in the morning. Yeah, fair few of us. Tech is such a huge part of our lives, and I think you'll really get a lot out of this evening. It's a cracking read, Disconnect, and I'm just going to start, before I introduce Jordan and Pete properly, with one sentence as a bit of an introduction to this book, because it's how I personally feel about the internet most days. Quote is, "Something is happening that is turning smart, rational individuals into pathological caricatures, and it's to do with being online." So I'll let Jordan talk a little bit more about the book and introduce it to you. But Jordan is a research fellow at the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. He's a former digital strategist at the ABC and head of social media at SBS, and the co-editor, along with Pete, of the Public Square project. And Pete Lewis, some of you might recognise him from when he's on The Drum, or if you're an Australia Institute supporter, from our fortnightly pole position with Murpharoo. And Pete also is director of the Centre for Responsible Technology at the Australia Institute. Welcome to you both. A round of applause, please, for our panel tonight. Jordan, why don't you start us off by telling us why you wrote the book and why you structured it the way you did?
Sure. So firstly, thank you to everybody for making the time and coming out today. It's great to see. It's a great looking room. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it. I think there were 2 main catalysts for the book for me. I spent a bit of time in Silicon Valley, and that was a really eye-opening experience. And it sounds a little bit cliche, but for me, it was actually life-changing. So I've been into technology for a long time and really held big tech to this kind of ideal. But when I moved there and sort of started to see what was around, I lived in the Bay Area, there was so much homelessness. I would go into meetings in the Twitter headquarters and there was literally somebody passed out in the street. You had to sidestep, their manure on the street. There were needles. And so like the vision of tech as this kind of nirvana versus the reality of the street around was really quite jarring. So that's when I started to question, there's something in the brochure that lied. that wasn't, what they were selling us. But I think the catalyst for the book specifically was when I started to notice people around me start to become some of these caricatures. So a good friend of mine, and I call out a couple of them in the book, became a conspiracy theorist. And it happened sort of over time. It was really subtle, but it actually happened. Another one, I fell out of, another really good friend of mine became like a pathological sort of social media narcissist, and I just couldn't speak to her anymore. So it was kind of happening all around, and even before I wrote the book, I spoke to lots of different people, and everybody I spoke to really validated the idea that we actually know one of these people now, whether we admit it or not. And in some instances, we're sort of going through it ourselves directly. And so it felt like there was something bigger happening, and it was worthwhile unpacking all of that and just figuring out what's actually going on.
And for those who haven't read the book yet, Jordan's, I think, structured it in a way that makes it really accessible. So he's looked at kind of different archetypes, would we call them,
Yeah.
of people online and how they get, I guess, pushed to extremes. And those are the online conspiracy theorist, the freedom fighter, the social media narcissist, the hateful troll, the dating app pest. Come across a few of those. Yeah. The screen addict and the naive futurist. And he's got different chapters basically associated with digging into those different archetypes. So I just wanted to kick off, I guess, before we bring Pete into the conversation, with why you wrote the book in that way.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that the ideas were accessible. So often when we talk about tech, it can get quite conceptual and really jargony. We throw around terms like algorithmic bias or surveillance capitalism, and it doesn't really mean too much for a lot of people. But if you talk about your uncle who's become a bit of a cooker, or your friend who attended a lockdown protest and is a conspiracy theorist, all of a sudden it's relatable, and actually you start to realize this is around me, I know this person, I probably care about this person. And there's still the same tech issues, but just through that human lens.
Pete, I might bring you in at this point because you've written a lot about tech and very interested in obviously all this as well. We find ourselves, I feel like, at a bit of a moment where we're really digging deep into some of the problems that we've created for ourselves. In terms of this book, what do you think this brings that people might not have considered before?
People. And it's interesting. I look at this as actually the third part in a trilogy that Jordan and I have ended up collaborating on. So I first met Jordan in 2019. I'd put out a book called Webtopia, which was my own kind of midlife crisis. I'd been a tech optimist and had worked in tech for a long time. And I ended up writing a book about how I felt we'd lost our way. And Jordan reached out, I think, on the internet. I'm not sure what platform now, Jordan. And we had a coffee and he said, what can we actually do about it? And it felt like it was just at the point where Zuboff had put out Surveillance Capitalism, which is an incredible Marxist analysis of where we're at if people haven't read it. But it was, well, let's just start sharing ideas. And so that was about the time where we pitched the Centre for Responsible Technology to the Australia Institute. I remember coming down here sort of just before lockdown, and I think we had a bit of a politics in the pub around some of these issues. And then through lockdown, we got the ideas going, and it was really exciting, and we used, all the new tools of technology to connect and share the ideas. We do a fortnightly webinar called Burning Platforms, and Jordan and I last year edited what I see as the second part in that journey, which was the Public Square Project, which was a series of essays about some of the policy challenges we had around building it. But even then, and I think we came back, I think we were here this time last year with Catherine Murphy launching that book. But if I look back on both of those projects, the missing piece was to really understand the people. And Jordan, out of the digital world, he understands UX, where you start with the person and you build the persona. And I think what's really groundbreaking about this book is that rather than pontificating or bloviating, as some of us are tend to do. He's done the hard yards of talking to people and bringing their stories to life. And it's really compelling because he's right. Everyone knows someone that's being dragged in different ways. And I think that the big systemic pieces in Webtopia that said something's not quite right, the academic pieces in the Public Square project, it's almost like we've got it arse end up, but now we've landed on the people, and I think it's the most effective form of advocacy is always to start with the people.
So speaking of the people, we're going to dig into a couple of these archetypes and chapters in a bit more specifics. And one that relates, I think, very much to the people of Canberra is the freedom fighter chapter and the kinds of people that ended up on the convoy to Canberra and bailed up on the lawns of Parliament House for many weeks. Tell us about some of those people that you spoke to.
Yeah, so firstly, I'm very ambivalent about the term cooker because I'm trying not to uniformly dismiss them, but in the book, I make a distinction between the people who led those movements, so the ringleaders, and they actually organize, they fundraise, they're profiting from them, and basically everybody else and the attendees. And so I actually spoke to a lot of freedom fighters, and there was some real trauma there. And if I tried very much to come from a place of empathy, because I think we can all agree that the lockdowns and the pandemic, I don't think anybody went out of that period unscathed. And so at least from that point of view, I felt like I could sympathize with them. And there was definitely, like, if you tear away all the specifics, the conspiracy theories, all the nonsense, there was quite a bit of trauma, which was a common theme. And if you read the book, there's some quite heartbreaking case studies in there. And I think there was something going on that the digital platforms were making a lot worse. And so I think that trauma and the fear and the uncertainty of that time was very much taken advantage of, both from the ringleaders of those movements, but also the technology platforms that were sort of targeting those vulnerable people and mobilizing them into these movements. And so I wanted to make sure that we add in a bit of color to those characters, and that's what the book really tries to do.
And I was also interested in that chapter about, I think there was one person that you spoke to who kind of came out the other side of things.
Yeah.
What led to that situation?
Yeah, so her name was Ash Jackson. She was a trans woman from Melbourne. She became really involved in the freedom fighter movement. And so for her, it was less about the conspiracy theories, it was less about the lockdowns, but it was the idea that Australia felt like it was becoming a police state over that period. And so one of the videos that really triggered her was when a young woman, I think she was from Victoria, I think her name was Zoe, I can't remember her last name, started a protest, and she didn't really know that you weren't allowed to do that during that time. And so there's this horrible video of the police just banging on her door and arresting her, and she was pregnant. And so for Ash, that was really triggering. And Facebook did what it does, and it tagged Ash as being interested in that type of content. And so during lockdown, she was just on Facebook every day, and she kept seeing feeds of police brutality and extremism until all of a sudden, for her, that became all-consuming, that became her world. And so she found the freedom movement. And I think a lot of, again, that trauma, people were looking for answers. They were looking for community. They were looking for some sort of thing to blame for that period. And so she got really heavily involved. But, sort of long story short, a year and a half later, she was attending a protest, and there was this moment where the police were sort of confronting their group, and she thought her crew were right behind her, but they actually sort of turned around and ran, and they left her on her own. And so that was one of the catalysts for her to kind of go, maybe this solidarity is not so real. maybe this is, kind of fake. And so that's the process that started her way out of it, essentially.
And Pete, Jordan touched there on, the algorithm doing its thing and serving up these kinds of people similar types of content. And we've had, and Jordan touches on in the book, a number of whistleblowers from Facebook or now Meta and other things talk about the way algorithms really take those kinds of things and just intensify them and make them worse. What does the policy change look like there?
Well, one of the issues is that algorithms are regarded as like a trade secret. So they're the engine that drive the social platforms, but unlike the engine of a car you drive down the road where it needs to be tested and made sure it's not going to kill anyone, this is regarded as almost a trade secret. So one of the really interesting conversations which is rolling out at the moment is this idea of algorithmic transparency. We need to know how these algorithms work. It's not just giving you what you want. What we've also got from the Facebook whistleblowers is they know that information that riles you up, that makes you more excited and angry does better. It keeps you online longer, and that means you're producing more data to then be rendered and used to target ads at you. So the whole thing's this vicious, evil cycle. It was interesting at the start of the lockdown, if you remember some of the public health warnings, apart from stay at home, was get off social media, because they knew it was making people more and more anxious. So the one bit that is really interesting at the moment, the bit of reform that is worth having a look at, is coming through from former Human Rights Commissioner Ed Santo, who is now working at UTS's Human Technology Institute. He's put forward a model law on AI which says you just can't build an algorithm without proving, for instance, that it complies with Australian laws around anti-discrimination. And that's really, and what they're saying is that before a high impact piece of AI is unleashed on the public, there needs to be someone having a look inside the black box to see what's going on. So that's happening in our country. It's before our AG, and it's quite transformative. So it's a long way from a law that sounds really pointy-headed, but it leads straight back to the people Jordan's speaking to.
Yeah, and Jordan, in the book you kind of talk about what some of those whistleblowers have revealed about how damaging those algorithms can be. What are some of the impacts? What are some of the negative consequences that the social networks know about and do anyway?
Yeah. So the most public one was from a woman called Frances Haugen, and it was internal research that was commissioned by Facebook that sort of proved that Instagram in particular was toxic for young people, in particular women. And so there was actually like a high degree of suicidal ideation, mental health issues, depression, etc. But the other one that is timely again, because I think he was on the news earlier this week, was the Christchurch mosque shooter. And so there was actually that commission, royal commission from the New Zealand government that actually found that that guy was radicalized on YouTube way more than the actual terrorist website. So I think the quote was something like, YouTube was a source of inspiration and motivation for the Christchurch shooter. So the links are, it's like a thick line now. Yeah.
The other chapter I wanted to ask you about was the conspiracy theorists and the trolls. And I'm not sure how much overlap there is between the two, but the conspiracy theorists strike me as kind of where a lot of people, I don't know, get sucked in. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's probably, so to your other point, there's a lot of crossover between the archetypes. So the freedom fighters are probably conspiracy theorists. The social media narcissist is probably a screen addict, and the dating app pest probably trolls women all the time, so they're just like useful entry points, but really it's not clean at all. But the conspiracy theorist is interesting because one of the origins of a lot of the conspiracy theories that we have now is QAnon. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. And it's bizarre, it started in the US, And sort of over time, it became this kind of amorphous monster that didn't make sense anymore, but it kept absorbing other conspiracy theories into it. And, you know, it started in 2016, we all sort of thought, why would somebody from Ballina or Hobart care about Donald Trump, right? It's because through the internet, we absorbed those ideas wholesale, and there was no context and there was no real reason. And that's why I sort of point the focus a lot on social media, because if you look at it in isolation, a lot of those conspiracy theories do not make any sense to Australians at all. And yet now we have people all over Australia who just believe all this nonsense.
And the other thing that stuck out to me, I think it was from that chapter, and speaking of overlap between the different archetypes, was kind of how during the pandemic in particular, the QAnon conspiracy theorists ended up sucking in like Instagram wellness bloggers and that kind of anti-vaxxers, and they all end up in the one tent.
Yes. Yeah, they're called pastel QAnon, so kind of like mummy bloggers and wellness therapy, crystal loving, light bringing, etc. And it's interesting how that happened. And so apparently, like, the wellness movement are natural vaccine skeptics and they don't like science in general. But the thing that connected it was about saving the children. So there was a branch of QAnon conspiracy where apparently, you know, Hillary Clinton and Obama were like drinking children's blood to create this thing called adrenochrome that is meant to give you, you know, immortality.
Sounds scientific.
Extremely scientific. So that little nugget was kind of, you know, taken by the wellness movement, and it became this rallying cry for, you know, save our kids. And so there were a lot of them just started creating save their children content because it'll give them more engagement. It felt like a good cause to get behind, and they didn't realize that it actually came from QAnon. And so that's why QAnon is so insidious, because it tends to absorb all these nonsense ideas and legitimizes it.
But it's really like this bizarre virtual reality game in that Q sets out little breadcrumbs that can be read in many different ways, but are interpreted as, you know, exposing pedophilia rings in pizza stores in New York. Serious. And there are members of the US Congress who have been elected basically through the energy and the community that's been created. And
there might be a few more elected by the time we finish
I don't know.
tonight.
I keep wanting to check my phone. I don't think it's going quite as bad, but it's still pretty bad tonight. Yeah.
Before we move on to this kind of social media narcissist for something perhaps a bit lighter, I did just want to ask you to reflect on some of those differences, Jordan, that you outlined in the way social media companies manage their own online environments. And I was really struck by Reddit in particular, which relies a lot more on human moderators and enforced kind of community standards that those internal communities create, versus Facebook's kind of much more automated approach.
Yeah, so there was a thread between some of the more darker platforms and Facebook, and in the book I say Facebook and YouTube kind of normalize these things, and there's actually a lot of, you know, really vile stuff that happens all the time in platforms like 4chan and 8chan. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's too weird and too strange for most of us to get in those spaces. So they're genuinely niche platforms. But there were a couple of jumping off points that led to the conspiracies breaking out, essentially. So one was when it jumped from 4chan to 8chan into Reddit. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Reddit. It's kind of a series of forums, essentially, with a lot of specific subjects. So that was one way it got a bit more mainstream. But Reddit still has a few controls in place. And so there are these things called karma points, where if you're an active Reddit member, you know, if you have like a score of 1,000, people know that you're kind of real. Whereas if you're there and you have a score of 1, then you're probably a grifter who's just causing trouble. And so Reddit has a bunch of controls that still kind of tend to manage the content. Whereas the real problem was when it jumped from Reddit into Facebook and YouTube. And Facebook and YouTube don't moderate anything because it's costly, you know, they don't bother. And they don't think they have a responsibility of doing those things. So, you know, what was in this niche place became basically spread, and it got mainstreamed and popularized. And that's when the problem started to really happen, because we all just kind of copped it with no controls around it.
And Pete, that really, I guess, shows that it doesn't have to be the way Facebook does it, that there are alternatives. You can create different types of communities and different rules, and yeah, but we just haven't really gone down the path of regulation at all when it comes to social media in particular. How much of a problem are we looking at there?
Largely it comes down to recognising what the business models behind the social media platforms are. And Rod Sims, when he handed down the report into digital platforms, got it totally right. They're advertising monopolies. So they exist to sell ads. They don't exist to connect. Their business model is to sell ads. And of course, with the time and the resources and the energy, we could build models that serve other purposes other than selling ads, and they'd be very different looking platforms. To me, a lot of it comes back to the model of development of technology is driven by venture capitalism. It's driven by people who want to be the next billionaire. You know, Robert Reich is right. Every billionaire is a public policy failure, and billionaires run all our major platforms. So, but we also have choices. There's this really vibrant debate going on at the moment for those that have already jumped off Facebook. Do we now jump off Twitter now that another billionaire's taken over that with a bunch of values that don't seem conducive to civility? And it'll be interesting how that plays out. Do we actually, do these platforms fill such a void that we submit to them? Are we able to find solace in other forms of connection? Coming to a place like this in real life, sharing, email threads or discussion boards. The original internet wasn't like this. The original internet was a series of discussion boards that people shared in. No one made money out of it. People built the infrastructure on free software, and it was a joint enterprise. It almost seems naively utopian now, but in 2 or 3 short decades, it got monetized, and there are consequences to those models.
We'll go to questions from the audience in another few minutes, but I did have a couple of final questions. One, I did want to touch on the social media narcissist and that chapter, because I just think in my own life, friends that I know who on Instagram look like they've got the most amazing life ever, and only because I'm besties with them do I know that things are falling apart in the background. But I think you were talking about something slightly different from that, but we've all got experience of kind of being addicted to our phones. Tell us a little bit about the social media narcissist.
Yeah, that one was a little bit personal. So the case study that I chose was that good friend of mine who I had a falling out with. And, we've all probably been to like a birthday party, and the example that I gave was it was her kid's first birthday. Anyway, it was awful, and she only cared about the Instagram photos afterwards, is like long story short. And so what the chapter tries to unpack is, through these social platforms, relationship with what's real or what things are supposed to look like is kind of getting warped. So a birthday party all of a sudden is a photo shoot, or like a random thought becomes an inspirational quote that we plaster out there, So like we're constantly performing to the standards of these social media platforms, and it's obviously not healthy. And there's this really great phrase, I can't remember the academic, but he called it flat time. So in social media, flat time doesn't exist because everything's kind of shortened. So like on Instagram, it's a really curated experience, and you only see the highlights. So you see the beautiful holiday, you see the nice birthday party, you see the graduation and all that stuff. And the bits in the middle, which is kind of reality,
Waiting in an airport.
is flat. And so if we only see those highlights, that starts to warp our understanding or our standards about, what should real life actually be.
Before we get to questions from the audience, and if you do have questions for Jordan, we've got a microphone up here, if you could come and line up there for us. I did want to spend a little bit of time discussing some of the public policy solutions that you canvass in the book. How do we go about fixing some of these problems, or at least arresting the decline or the polarisation, shall we say?
Yeah, so there's some I think regulators are starting to do some stuff, which is really encouraging. The Privacy Act is one of them, online safety. There's a few, Europe is definitely leading the way with a lot of these regulations, but regulation takes a very long time. We've got to start somewhere, I suppose. But the Privacy Act is kind of interesting, and I know we're paying attention to that with Centre for Responsible Technology and with the data breaches and all that sort of stuff. I think we're in this interesting period where everybody, including institutions, is trying to grapple with what to do next. And a lot of the regulation is going to be imperfect, but we've kind of got to start somewhere. Yeah.
Pete, I was going to ask you, we've been talking a little bit about privacy being one of the next big fights, and I feel like for a lot of people, we kind of care about it, but we've also traded a lot of our privacy, to sign up and participate in these platforms and have become the product. But, with the Medibank breach and the Optus privacy breaches, it's now quite real for millions of Australians who might have their medical records or their passport details, out there for anyone to consume. Do you think that's changed how people think about privacy?
Definitely. Look, I've been doubly breached. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago about my vasectomy being out there, amongst other things. But I think it's moving the Overton window. With the lived experience of the data breaches, it raises a number of conversations. One is, why are they collecting all this stuff in the first place? Why is our identity, to prove our identity, we've got to prove it over and over again, and we're not just showing our driver's licence, we're giving over our driver's licence, we're giving over our 100-point ID, and then we've got a legal responsibility on companies to hold it for national security laws, which all goes back to the fact that the government worked out back in 2001 that if they got into the back of our computers and metadata, they might stop people blowing planes up. Good on them, but it was one way of doing it. The consequences of that flow right through today, because the capabilities that governments discovered in the name of national security were then harnessed by the big tech platforms to build the surveillance models that have driven themselves. So it's not, to me, as simple as regulating and policing the internet, because we know what that looks like at the end game in a country like China, where everything is regulated and controlled. But we've also seen a model in America where if it's totally laissez-faire, there are a whole bunch of consequences there as well. At the moment, we feel closer to America than China in the way we deal with it, but there is another model, which is the European model of building structures and frameworks in place. So, it's interesting. Even with the data breaches, the knee-jerk from the government has been to move really quickly to increase the fines for companies that don't handle the data well. And that's great, except that just creates more opportunity for the cybersecurity industry to be charging more and more to make systems safe. Again, great, but it doesn't deal with the question, why is this stuff being collected in the first place? So you've got the cop on the beat, which is great. Unfortunately, our Office of Information doesn't have many resources to actually do much. And then you've got the systemic changes. We have not updated our privacy laws in 40 years, and every time we try to do it, media companies push back because they don't want to be sued for breach of privacy. And I don't know if people know this as well. Do you know who else has got an exemption from the Privacy Act? Political parties. They can collect anything they want in the name of democracy. And small business, including real estate agents. So There is movement on privacy through the Parliament, which should happen in the first quarter of next year. I think all of a sudden it's gone from being really boring to really sexy. And yeah, we want to be all over that in the first quarter of next year.
Can I get an indication from the audience if you or someone you know has been a victim of these last couple of data breaches from Optus or Medibank? Yeah? Yeah. It's a lot of people. I think the Prime Minister was saying he's a Medibank customer as well. That's a bit hairy to think our Prime Minister's medical details might be out there on the interwebs. I do think that makes it a much more kind of gives people a much more personal stake in this debate. Jordan, given how we've gone so far on this, and as Pete's just said, we haven't updated it in 40 years, how hopeful are you that we're actually going to get somewhere this time around? Because it seems like there's stakes now.
Yeah, I'm a natural optimist. I think there's definitely growing awareness from everyday people about online harms. There's a lot more interest about what we can do about it. And the message of the book, I guess, is, you might think that technology doesn't care, or you might not care about technology, but technology cares about you. So you should really start paying attention because it's monitoring you, it's tracking what you do, all your habits. So we've got to do something about it.
Yeah. Just checking if we've got questions from the audience, if anyone wants to come up and start asking questions, either for Jordan or Pete, please come on up. I think we've got a couple here. Do you want to come?
Lucas at the front.
Here we go. Lukash?
Hi, Jordan.
Hi.
I'm curious what you think about the situation with Twitter and whether you think that people flocking to Mastodon is an opportunity for more democratic public square.
I've gotten asked that so many times this week. Mastodon is really tricky, but then I don't know if you're on Twitter. If you remember the first time you ever logged onto Twitter, it was really weird. It was like, you want me to tweet about what? And you want me to @? People? So I have some hope that Mastodon might be a viable replacement. But look, Elon Musk, super volatile. He changes things daily. But just the idea that one person owns such a big part of our communication system is obviously a problem.
But can I also, I want to challenge whether we all really want to be on some big ubiquitous system anyway. And does the behaviours that you identify in your book, Jordan, they seem to be a natural consequence of the individual and then everything. And I'm really interested much more in how we find our connections in communities of interest, geographical communities, communities of political action, because I actually think there's an argument for small tech as opposed to big tech.
Yeah, I reckon small tech is getting more popular. And, there's that idea of Dunbar's number, which is the amount of relationships we can actually handle, and it's 150. And it's the size of a small triad. So maybe...
Real friend compared to Facebook friend, yeah.
Yeah. I think the idea of a homogenized online experience for the whole world is kind of absurd, really.
Next question.
Just quickly, Mastodon is actually sort of small tech. It's a fediverse of sort of small tech. But listening to sort of the stories and the anecdotes of young Australians being radicalised by things that don't matter overseas, I was reminded of 100 years ago, Aussies being radicalised by fascism via newspapers. Hutus being radicalised and murdered Tutsis by radio and sort of Alan Jones's followers and the sort of the Cronulla rioteers. At no point in the past did we blame the medium. It wasn't newspapers' fault or radio, but we're blaming social media. We seem to be absolving the organisers and the followers of their responsibility for their conduct, and perhaps falling into the trap of blaming the social media, because it is the social media that largely contributed to that last excellent election campaign we had and the election result. It was against the interests of the oligarchs. So I'm a bit suspicious when I hear it's all social media's fault, when this is a human constant. People have been radicalised for a very long time. What's the difference between the stupidity that people have done in the past via newspaper and radio and now?
I reckon there's two main differences. So firstly, the media ecosystem, very imperfect, lots of issues, but we still have a degree of control over it. There's still journalistic standards, editorial standards before things go out. There are still laws, you need to be qualified. So, while there are issues, we retain some degree of control over that situation. Whereas in social media, there's absolutely no degree of control. So I think that's one. And the other one is the sheer scale and size of the platforms, which I think is what's different. And so if you have this environment where there's no regulation and no control, and you have no other choice but to be in that platform, I think that's very different from a situation where, there's a local paper and, you can choose to look at it or not.
I think it was an excellent question, and I agree with both your responses, Jordan. The only thing I'd add is back to my earlier comment that when pieces of information have business models built around them designed to excite, divide, and keep people engaged for longer, it's a lot different to getting a paper where you've got a whole bunch of different articles that you can filter through and make your own decisions about what you listen to. But thank you for the question.
And
That's the business model of talkback radio.
yeah, and to be clear, the Australian Institute's very much supportive of media reforms as well. Nothing wrong with a bit of a bit more regulation there either. Next question.
So, hi, I can't remember who said this, but someone said that technology's short-term consequences are always overestimated and the long-term consequences are underestimated. And today, Stephen Fry, who had 12.5 million Twitter followers, deleted his account. He moved to Mastodon, and that, obviously he's queer, and this forces people, if they want to follow his life, and many people do, to seek him out there. That mass migration in Twitter is, I think, well underway. I have 54,000 followers on Twitter. I'm walking away from it too, and that's a lot of power and voice.
Massive investment as well.
Yeah, time, 12 years. And rebuilding networks is actually really hard work. Mastodon, or as I'm trying to call it, Masty. I'm trying to make Masty happen. It is kind of small tech because the servers are distributed. You can move from server to server. If you don't like the admin overlord, you can find another one. They defederate. So there was a whole server of Nazis that formed, and they defederated it from the whole Fediverse. So these technologies, I think, are really interesting. And many people my age, I'm 52, are getting kind of excited because it's getting back to IRC and it's getting back to message boards. My first ever experience of a message board was talking to Julian Assange in a nightclub. And so I try and tell my kid this, and this is, I'm getting to my point, I promise. I've really got sympathy, Peter, with what you're saying about real-world connections and geographical connections, but I think that ship has largely sailed, especially for the kids. Now, I don't want to get all boomer about this because that's the last thing. I felt often my parents were policing my consumption of television, but children are consuming social media. Now, my kid thinks the Fediverse is entirely cringe, and so does my sister's kid. They insist to us we can see through the algorithm, we see what it's doing. We've lived with algorithms all our lives. I feel like telling him about the Fediverse and getting all excited about the Masty is like telling him to eat brown bread and stop taking drugs. I wonder your thoughts on that.
Well, I have a dream. I'm actually been thinking about this for a while, and Jordan, in my book on the Public Square project, posited, shouldn't there be, a public social network sort of akin to the ABC with objectives to build civil connection. I don't think the ABC will do it, but a lot of my thinking over the last year has been around, do any of you guys, I'm sure you do, you watch Australia Institute webinars. Stay with me for a sec. I reckon that really good, and I think we discovered this through lockdown, really good experiences in a virtual meeting, a Zoom, are not just being on the internet. You're sharing time and space with other people in a virtual environment. It's kind of what Zuckerberg's talking about with the metaverse, that we're moving deeper into the internet. We're not just on the internet. So I think there's something interesting in getting more coordinated in organising the way we come together in line as opposed to online. And I think we've just got to be open to new and different possibilities and models over the next couple of years. I think it's really this challenging moment where there's this knee jerk that people are saying, get off Twitter because Musk is a nutcase and they're going to destroy it, and maybe they will. Maybe authentic, making people pay to use it is actually part of the solution to parts of the internet as well. So I don't know how that will all play out. I feel a bit personally intimidated to jump into Mastodon because I'm actually not that techie. I'm an absolute Luddite, but I will have a crack at that. And I think it's all about finding things that work, but also thinking about not a platform you need to be in all the time or on all the time, but thinking about what other connections you want. And do you really want to be scrolling the phone when you're around the kitchen table with your family, or, so just being a bit more mindful of the way we use all this technology.
And just to add to that, I used to love IRC. I had my own channel. So maybe Mastodon is like this version of IRC, and we're seeing it kind of cycle back to that healthier version of social media anyway.
My only observation is that telling kids not to do drugs is extremely effective, so I'm sure you'll have great luck with Mastodon. Next question, thank you.
Yeah, Nancy Reagan was onto a winner there, wasn't she?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hi. Just a couple of observations. Sorry, first of all, I haven't been to politics in the pub for a while, but there used to be a roving mic, and just a bit of feedback that maybe some people might feel intimidated having to come forward like this, like it from your point of view.
It's a nice and intimate experience, yeah.
From our point of view, it's
Partly
a little bit...
this is a hangover from COVID times where we didn't want to hand stuff around just one central kind of place. But yeah, thank you for that feedback.
Yeah, fair enough. Secondly, I'm very curious, the first gentleman had a little... No, not the first gentleman. Yeah, you've got a little Twitter icon on the back of your T-shirt. I'm wondering if you're maybe in the industry or something?
He's an interest.
Okay. Because it is the actual blue Twitter bird, yeah? Yeah. Yeah, anyway, I was standing right behind you, so I couldn't avoid seeing it. But, yeah, okay, cool.
Do you have a question?
I do, yeah. I actually did raise that for a point because I was wondering if there was a vested interest in raising that question, which was specifically about Twitter. But yes, so we all have our news, actually probably many of us don't have a news feed anymore. We maybe get our feed directly from social media, but I'm a bit old-fashioned. I go to ABC mostly, but it's pretty obvious that news organisations are becoming increasingly like social media in the way that they present the news. So, for example, a lot of articles are actually opinion pieces, but it's not really that explicit necessarily. And there isn't like here's the news, here's the opinion section, like the old-fashioned newspapers where you could actually filter. We talked about this earlier. I'm wondering about your thoughts about the contribution of even news sites themselves into this, perpetuating this situation that we're into.
Well, I worked for a lot of those news sites, and I was very guilty of trying to adapt social media platforms into news media. So there was actually a period where the social media platforms actively courted news organizations because they only had originally, your friends and family. And so a lot of money and investment was actually poured out of social media platforms to actively get news media's information. And so what we find ourselves in this situation now where there's an interdependency there that's really difficult to untangle, and obviously there are a lot of issues there. But yeah, the platforms definitely courted news media organizations to legitimize them as information channels, essentially. So I don't have an answer about how to disentangle that now, but yeah, it was very deliberate.
Yeah, and that takes me back to the news media bargaining code as well, because partly why they're caught up in that is because of revenue, and they're all tied up there.
And look, we leaned in behind the news media bargaining code 18 months ago, on one level holding our nose because we realised a lot of it would go to Murdoch, but in the last couple of years, you guys probably haven't seen it, but the newsrooms have started hiring people again. The Guardian's increased their newsroom by about 40%. Nine and Herald have stopped sacking journalists. I was talking to one of my mates who works there the other day saying we're no longer being expected to file 2 or 3 stories a day. It's now 3 good stories a week. There has been a change, and it's been a change because of value transfer that we demanded through that Rod Sims inquiry I spoke about before, the News Media Bargain Code, that's seen about $150 million for the next 3 years transferred from the digital platforms across to the media companies. Now, it's not perfect. It's not the whole story. Privacy was another recommendation from Sims. But there is some grounds for optimism around where the Australian news media is up to at the moment, and people don't really talk about it.
Next question.
Thank you. My question is, does social media sort of force a rethink of freedom of speech? On the one hand, we seem to have let companies into our living room selling us rage based on this idea of freedom of speech. On the other hand, the idea of controlling online speech is very popular with nasty authoritarian regimes. So, do we need to rethink freedom of speech because of social media? How can we do that without giving up hard-won rights?
I feel like people have different or interpretations of what freedom of speech means, which is part of the problem. And what's tricky for me in social media is that erosion of a common understanding between everybody. And so now if you have an argument with somebody, it's grounds for a different set of facts. So, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own set of facts. And the fact that we're questioning that foundation is really tricky.
Murphy calls that kind of we're in the post-truth world.
But there's also this sense, like, it's a very American construct, libertarianism and freedom of speech. And I think what we're seeing is actually platforms that have built on a libertarian mindset finding their way into a culture that has always been more organised. So in Australia, we've never had pure freedom of speech. There were requirements on the media. There's libel laws, there's slander laws. Like, if you slag off against someone in the pub, there's a course of action. And so this idea...
And we only have implied freedom of speech, as
Indeed,
it turns out, as well.
But also, at the early days of the internet, there was this critical piece of legislation passed in the US. It's Section 230 of their Communications Act, which said that any internet carrier would not be responsible for what it was carrying. It was akin to a telephone company not being responsible for what you said over the phone, and that kind of drove that whole idea that you could allow anything to happen and you wouldn't be responsible. The inflection point to me was when those platforms started monetizing and influencing what people saw on the platforms. It became something totally different. Now, we struggle for the metaphor about what these platforms are. Is it like a telephone line? Is it a publisher? Is it something more akin to a water company where you've got to actually have clean pipes and good quality water going through? We're still scrabbling that, but I think the starting point of freedom of speech is the wrong place to start. We've got to see that it's been a creation of American laws in a libertarian context.
Anything else to add to that one, Jordan? On freedom of speech, I do think it's interesting too the way that intersects. We've talked a lot about the intersection between social media platforms and the actual media itself. And the media also seems to be struggling a bit with freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and some of those issues coming up quite frequently as well. I did just want to bring us, I guess, back to the book and the kind of optimism that you had for technology to begin with, Jordan, because I think a lot of us felt that way, and we're all promised all these great things were going to be delivered by technology, and in many ways it has delivered on that. We're more connected than than any other time. No matter what you're into, you can find your niche little community of people that love that particular thing as well. There's a lot of great things that it has delivered, But in terms of, I guess, coming back to that optimism and where it all went, where it all went wrong, I mean, what's your vision for where we could take things and what it might look like if we can start to steer the ship in a much nicer direction?
Yeah. It's getting harder to be optimistic with Musk and all Kanye and all this stuff. But yeah, I guess, the more aware we are of these issues, the more we can sort of do something about it. And the fact that, we're having this discussion here and, the book has been really well received, I'm generally quite optimistic with that result. And there's a rebalancing happening with all over the world, and it's just we're in that difficult transition period where we've gotten used to a specific set of digital platforms, and we're trying to navigate our way out of it. So there's probably a teething period where it'll be really difficult and crap, and then hopefully on the other side of that, it'll start to get a little bit better.
Excellent. Well, we might wrap it up there, and we might see you all on Mastodon if you abandon Twitter like Stephen Fry, once we can all figure out how we get on there. I'm a little bit troubled that I needed a whole explainer to figure out how to get on there, but maybe I will figure it out. If I could please get a round of applause for Jordan Guiao and Pete Lewis. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. This is the book, and it's a fabulous one. It's Disconnect. You can grab your copy over here from Paper Chain. I'm sure Jordan
will be signing.
Yeah, hang around to even sign a few copies if you like. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Our next event is on Wednesday, the 30th of November, and we don't have guests locked in for that yet, but we'll come back to you as soon as we do. That's probably going to be our end of year wrap, essentially. I want to thank all the staff at Verity Lane Market who make tonight possible. Don't forget to grab another drink before you go and eat some delicious food from downstairs. I do miss the ramen place, but the South African curry was really delicious tonight if you need to try something new. Thank you always to the Australia Institute staff that make tonight possible, Hannah Brown and Hayden Starr in particular, who did all the AV tonight by his lonesome. Thank you, Hayden. And tonight's event was being live streamed as well, so thank you to everyone who joined us online. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. This week we're talking about our latest Climate of the Nation report. It's the country's longest running survey on attitudes to climate change. And thank you again for coming out this evening. We really love to see you at Politics in the Pub, and we appreciate your support. Don't forget to go and buy your copy of Disconnect. Thanks very much, everyone. Good night.